If you have ever walked away from a relationship that left you questioning your own memory, your own worth, and your own ability to make sound decisions, you already know how heavy that kind of exhaustion feels. It is not the clean fatigue that comes from hard work or honest effort. It is a deep, quiet depletion that settles in your nervous system. You carry it long after the conversations end, long after the door closes, and sometimes long after you have convinced yourself you are finally free. You replay moments. You second-guess your boundaries. You wonder if you were too sensitive, too demanding, or if you simply missed the warning signs. The confusion lingers because you were not dealing with a straightforward disagreement. You were navigating an environment where reality was constantly reshaped to fit someone else's needs. You were asked to apologize for reactions that were completely normal. You were trained to believe that your clarity was the problem, when in fact, your clarity was the only thing keeping you grounded. None of this happened because you were flawed. It happened because you were placed in a dynamic where emotional imbalance was disguised as love, where manipulation was woven into everyday affection, and where your willingness to understand was used against you. You did not break the relationship by walking away. You stopped breaking yourself to keep it alive. What happens on the other side of that boundary is rarely discussed with honesty. People expect sudden apologies, immediate accountability, or a dramatic awakening. But psychological reality does not work that way. When someone who relies on control, validation, and emotional predictability loses access to it, the process that follows is not about remorse in the way we understand it. It is about recalibration. It is about the mind adjusting to a sudden loss of external regulation. What you might call regret is actually a series of internal shifts. These shifts are not meant to hurt you further, nor are they meant to justify what happened. They simply reveal how the human mind responds when a familiar dynamic collapses. Understanding this process is not about keeping track of what they feel. It is about freeing yourself from the need to monitor it. It is about recognizing that their journey after you leave follows a predictable psychological pattern, and that pattern has nothing to do with your worth, your mistakes, or your future. You do not need their regret to validate your decision. You only need to understand the mechanics so you can finally stop carrying the weight of what was never yours to hold. The first phase that unfolds is a period of dismissal and false certainty. In the immediate aftermath of your departure, the outward behavior often looks like complete indifference. There is a noticeable calm, a sense of moving forward, sometimes even a visible relief. Life continues uninterrupted. Social media stays active. New routines form quickly. To someone who has been drained, this can feel like proof that the relationship never mattered, that your presence was insignificant, or that you were the only one carrying the emotional weight. But this reaction is not about you at all. It is a psychological defense mechanism. The mind cannot tolerate sudden loss of control, so it constructs a narrative of stability. Denial becomes the first layer of protection. By acting unaffected, by maintaining the appearance of normalcy, the ego avoids the immediate sting of rejection. It is a way of saying, without words, that the boundary you set cannot change the internal reality. This phase is entirely about preservation, not truth. You likely felt invisible during this time. You questioned whether your pain was real. You wondered if you had overreacted. That reaction was completely understandable. When someone projects certainty while you are holding grief, it creates a dissonance that is hard to process. But the calm you witnessed was not peace, it was armor. And armor does not mean the wound does not exist. It only means the person has not yet allowed themselves to look at it. As the silence stretches and the expected reactions do not come, the second phase begins. This is where frustration and blame projection take over. The initial defense cracks. The mind starts searching for a reason why the dynamic shifted, and the easiest explanation is always external. You may notice subtle shifts in communication, indirect comments, rewritten histories, or a sudden emphasis on your flaws. Sometimes it appears as a casual remark shared with mutual acquaintances. Sometimes it shows up as a carefully worded message that places responsibility entirely on you. The behavior is not about honesty. It is about emotional regulation through externalization. When internal discomfort becomes too heavy to carry alone, the mind pushes it outward. Blame becomes a tool to restore a sense of control. By assigning fault, by framing the separation as your failure, the psychological pressure eases. This phase is deeply confusing for anyone who has been on the receiving end. You start questioning your own memory. You wonder if you were the difficult one. You carry guilt for decisions that were actually acts of self-preservation. That guilt is not yours. It was handed to you as part of a larger pattern. The anger you witness during this stage is not about what you did. It is about what they are unwilling to face. Recognizing this does not mean excusing the behavior. It means removing yourself from the role of emotional target. You were never the problem. You were simply the mirror they could no longer look into without discomfort. When the external strategies stop working and the boundary remains firm, the third phase emerges. This is the period of calculated reconnection and emotional bargaining. The mind shifts from protection to restoration. The absence becomes tangible. The routines that once relied on your presence now feel hollow. You may notice subtle attempts to re-establish contact, a casual check-in, a nostalgic reference, a sudden appearance in places you frequent. Sometimes it involves triangulation, where third parties are used to deliver messages or gauge your emotional state. These actions are not random. They are tests. The goal is not to apologize or to acknowledge harm. The goal is to measure whether the old dynamic still functions. Can the door be reopened? Will the boundaries soften? Is the familiar rhythm still accessible? This phase often creates intense confusion for anyone who has walked away. Old hope flickers. You wonder if this time will be different. You question whether your clarity was too harsh. That questioning is normal. It is the residue of a relationship that trained you to prioritize connection over consistency. But the reach you witness during this stage is not about regret. It is about recalibration. They are checking whether the system still responds. They are not asking whether they hurt you. They are asking whether the supply remains available. Understanding this distinction is crucial. It allows you to see the behavior for what it is, a psychological habit, not a genuine shift in awareness. You do not owe a response to a test. You only owe yourself the clarity to let it pass. When the attempts fail and the boundary holds, the fourth phase begins. This is the quiet collapse. The outward performance fades. The energy drops. The constant activity slows. There is a noticeable withdrawal, sometimes accompanied by sudden life changes, isolation, or a visible shift in mood. This is not a public breakdown. It is an internal reckoning. The strategies that once worked no longer function. The narratives that once provided comfort no longer hold. The mind is forced to confront the reality of permanent loss. For the first time, there is no one to regulate the emotional tension. There is no audience to validate the perspective. There is only the quiet space where the truth begins to surface. This phase is where the actual weight of what was lost starts to register. It is not necessarily about you as a person. It is about the absence of a structure that once provided stability, predictability, and external validation. You may notice this shift from a distance. You may hear about it through mutual connections, or you may simply sense the silence deepening. It can be tempting to feel sympathy, to wonder if you should reach out, to question whether your boundary caused unnecessary pain. But this phase is not yours to manage. It is a natural consequence of losing a dynamic that was never built on mutual accountability. You are not responsible for carrying someone else's internal adjustment. You are only responsible for honoring the boundary that protected you. The quiet collapse is not a punishment. It is a psychological necessity. It is the moment where the mind stops projecting and begins processing. And processing does not always look like remorse. Sometimes it looks like exhaustion. Sometimes it looks like surrender. Both are part of the same internal journey. The final phase is recalibration and acceptance, which does not always look the same for everyone. At this stage, the mind adapts to the new reality. The emotional turbulence settles into a new baseline. The person either integrates the experience, adjusts their patterns, and moves forward with a clearer understanding of their own role, or they reinforce the old defenses, replace the dynamic, and repeat the cycle elsewhere. Both outcomes are internal processes that no longer involve you. This is where the concept of regret finally takes shape, but it rarely looks like the apology you once hoped for. Regret, in this context, is not about undoing the past. It is about recognizing the cost of the patterns. It is about understanding that control is not connection, that validation is not love, and that emotional imbalance always leaves a residue. Some people reach this phase with genuine reflection. They begin to see how their behavior affected others. They start making quieter, more consistent changes. Others reach it by doubling down, by finding new ways to maintain the same structure. Both paths are valid psychological responses. Neither requires your participation. You do not need to wait for their awareness to validate your healing. You do not need their reflection to confirm your worth. The final phase simply confirms what you already know. Their journey is separate from yours. Your peace is not tied to their choices. Your clarity does not depend on their understanding. When you stop monitoring their process, you finally reclaim your own. Recognizing these phases is not about keeping score. It is about removing the mystery. It is about understanding that what you experienced was not random. It followed a predictable psychological rhythm. The dismissal, the blame, the testing, the quiet reckoning, the eventual recalibration. These are not stages designed to hurt you. They are stages that reveal how the mind protects itself when a familiar structure collapses. You were never the cause of the collapse. You were simply the boundary that made it visible. And that is enough. You do not need to analyze every message, decode every action, or wait for a closure that will never come in the format you once imagined. Closure is not something someone gives you. It is something you build for yourself by consistently choosing your own reality over someone else's version of it. You build it by recognizing patterns without chasing them. You build it by stepping back emotionally, even when the old habits whisper for attention. You build it by gaining clarity, not through confrontation, but through steady, quiet observation. When you stop trying to make sense of behavior that was never meant to make sense, you finally create space for your own truth to settle. Awareness is the turning point. It is the moment you realize that you do not need to participate in the cycle to understand it. You can watch the process unfold without getting pulled back into it. You can acknowledge the behavior without taking responsibility for it. You can feel the weight of what happened without letting it define your future. This is where boundaries stop feeling like punishments and start feeling like self-respect. A boundary is not a wall built out of anger. It is a line drawn out of clarity. It says, "This is where I end, and this is where your choices begin." Calm detachment is not indifference. It is the quiet decision to stop investing energy into outcomes you cannot control. It is the refusal to trade your peace for the illusion of connection. Self-respect is not loud. It does not demand attention. It simply shows up in the small, consistent choices you make when no one is watching. Choosing not to respond to a test. Choosing not to explain yourself to someone who has already decided your worth. Choosing to protect your energy instead of spending it on proving your point. These choices do not happen overnight. They are built through repetition, through quiet practice, through the daily decision to trust your own perception over someone else's narrative. Healing does not require you to forget. It requires you to stop carrying the weight of what was never yours to hold. You can acknowledge the relationship, the patterns, the confusion, and the exhaustion without letting them dictate your future. You can recognize the harm without letting it become your identity. Moving forward is not about pretending it did not matter. It is about deciding that it no longer controls you. Peace arrives in the moments when you stop waiting for external validation and start trusting your own internal compass. Strength is built in the quiet spaces where you choose yourself, even when it feels unfamiliar. Freedom is not the absence of pain. It is the presence of clarity. You do not need their regret to heal. You do not need their apology to move forward. You only need to keep honoring the boundary that brought you here. You did the right thing. You chose reality over illusion. You chose consistency over chaos. You chose yourself over a dynamic that asked you to disappear. That choice was not the end of your story. It was the beginning of your clarity. The weight you carried is already lightening. The confusion is already fading. The path ahead is not about looking back to see if they understand. It is about walking forward with the certainty that you already do. You are free. You are clear. You are whole. And from this place, you can finally breathe without wondering if the air belongs to someone else.